I guess we could probably start with the election. Now that we do have a little more clarity, it feels like, and we've heard this from a few CEOs this morning, the idea of stability at the very least seen as a good thing. What's been your take on that whole election story as it's unfolded?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, clearly the market likes stability more than open questions. But I think what the realization already is that, yes, it was a loss for Trump and a win for Biden, but it was also probably a win for Republicans and a loss for Democrats in terms of the blue wave.
Yeah.
And that probably will lead to some sort of continued deadlocks. And we'll see. I mean, Georgia is going to be a big thing from the Senate race.
And if you're a business operator and you're watching this, and quite frankly, I mean, you understand how businesses that are based in Canada and businesses that are based in the U.S. would look at a situation like that. Do you have to think about, gosh, what does gridlock mean for me? Or is there just too much other stuff going on right now that you really just have to focus on the day-to-day of running your operations?
Well, you certainly have teams that are working at or looking at the strategic options you have in front of you. But look, the world is coping with a pandemic. The world is, as of today, thinking that this might not be as bad as we thought it might have been. But it's also looking at how much change will actually get done, given a Congress that will likely be locked up.
Yeah, no doubt. Let's talk about you, Tim. Obviously, you've had such an interesting career working within the Canadian banking sector, and as we mentioned, your time as well with TD Ameritrade. Tell us what you've been up to these last few months.
Well, it's an interesting time to be back in Canada. I'm glad I'm not in Manhattan over this past year. But having said that, my old firm, TD Ameritrade, as you know, was sold to Schwab, and that deal just closed. They'll be doing a lot of trades today. When I got there, just to put it in perspective, about 4 years ago, a little over, they would have been doing about 300,000 trades today. My guess is over just at TD Ameritrade, they'll be doing 4 million plus trades today. So it really shows you what the interest in the markets is. Yeah. Pretty amazing.
Let's talk a little bit about that, just because we all were watching all that U.S. election coverage and everyone's trying to say, okay, who did they get to come out and vote? What were the demographics? Is it true, Tim, that because a lot of people literally have been spending a lot more time at home, they see what's going on in the stock market, the pool of people who are investing, that it is broadening out, diversifying, if you will, these days?
Absolutely. The retail investor segment has grown dramatically. It started, obviously, 45 plus years ago with the industry of the supposed discount brokers coming online. But remember, it's been now a year in the U.S. that the cost of a trade has dropped to zero. And that is what fueled an enormous increase, plus obviously the volatility you've seen as a result of the COVID pandemic and people with both stimulus checks and time on their hands to be staring at the screen and maybe something other than a Zoom call.
Yeah, no doubt. And, we had an interesting conversation with the head of Canaccord Genuity earlier talking about, a lot of companies going public and raising money. If there's a broader pool of investors, Tim, do you think that changes the way by which companies that are involved in the public markets, whether they're going to raise capital or however they approach, reaching out to investors, that too will change the messaging and the communication over time?
Absolutely. We were looking at alternate ways of tapping into all of the cash flow that was sitting on the sidelines, even more so now. And so capital markets, as we know, the public capital markets are diminishing in their importance in terms of the capital raise, certainly in the U.S., with public companies being about half what they used to be. But the idea of going after private money is a focus for all brokerage firms to be able to give access to the average retail investor, otherwise they wouldn't have. Yeah,
well, we had a great conversation earlier about cryptocurrencies too. I mean, there are so many different ways by which younger and older investors are watching the road ahead. As a business leader, what's your view on the road ahead? I mean, how do you feel about Canada, how we're navigating through this pandemic? What are some of the key things to be watching for as we wrap up what is probably one of the most unusual years in the lives of so many Canadians?
Well, let's face it, today's news is great, but it's also many, many months off. I think that there will be compounding news from other firms that will have come up with either therapeutics or other things that will contribute to the vaccine cause. So it's a great upbeat day. Having said that, we've got to keep our guard up as a nation in terms of all of the procedures that we're told, in terms of getting through the winter months. That's not going to be easy. And look, the Biden presidency will have an effect on Canada. He will generally be much more positively disposed to Canada, but he's got a lot of domestic issues he's going to need to solve that aren't small. When you call it the pandemic itself, whether it be the recession, whether it be record unemployment, all of these things are factors he's going to be focused on. And the U.S. generally is isolationist these days.
It's going to be interesting to watch the Biden presidency, both because he's got a lot in front of him today, but he also talked a lot, and people who saw him speak on Saturday night know about this bigger agenda that he has going forward. And companies sometimes have to deal with that too, the short term and long term. Your former firm, and you don't speak for TD Bank, but even this morning we covered it, the fact that they've introduced a global climate action plan, which is really focused on being net zero on carbon emissions by 2050. What are you hearing when it comes to businesses right now? I mean, you're on the board of Maple Leaf. They've made a strong commitment on that front as well, on you got to deal with today, but you also have these longer term plans, and how much of that has been disrupted, if you will, by this unprecedented 2020?
Well, Maple Leaf, as well as Mattamy Asset Management, the largest North American home builder board that I'm on as well, they're seeing exactly that, which is, if you asked them a few months ago, there were a number of issues that they were dealing with that was very short-term in nature. How do we get through the COVID pandemic? But they always keep their eye on the long term, very much focused on how do we make a difference in this world. And that's a good thing. That's very much a good thing from the CEOs of public and private firms. But the world is very uncertain. But there is no question, I don't think, that we are all going to be wanting to be focused more on our environment. And Maple Leaf and Mattamy in particular, and now TD certainly, is focused on our environmental future.
When it comes to just the way by which people are going to be trading in the future, you know, you mentioned the challenges that New York City has faced over this last year, one of the first big American cities that was impacted by COVID. And sadly, just looking at the numbers that are being reported today, those cases are going up again. What do you think that means, Tim, and just in terms of Wall Street as the place of doing business? You know, we're talking about work from home and companies changing where their centers are. Do we need to have a different conversation around the way by which trading, or the centers of the trading universe, whether it's Wall Street and Bay Street, if you've got all this technology at your fingertips?
Well, those conversations have been going on for 20 or 30 years, ever since the advent of the personal computer. But having said that, people are social animals and they're slow to change. I think the biggest learning we've had out of the pandemic has likely been that those trends that were already in play have been accelerated by probably 10 years, whether it be at-home shopping, whether it be work at home. And let's face it, the idea of commuting an hour each way in major centers like New York City to go sit in a cube and stare at a screen does not make a whole lot of sense going forward. And so I think companies have learned that lesson, and they've figured out, and they will have to figure out, how they can both make that work for them from a cultural point of view and from an employee point of view. But at the same time, there will be a significant disruption, in my view, in commercial real